Years before any of this happened, Savannah once suited up and took to the skis with her older brother. From the moment the wheels left the ground, she described it as something unforgettable. Controlled power, precision, and a kind of awareness most people will never experience. That moment matters more than it seems. Because somewhere in Vermont, in February of 2018, a colonel in the United States Air Force climbed into an F-16 Fighting Falcon for the final time. It wasn't new to him. It wasn't emotional in the way you'd expect. It was routine. He had done it thousands of times, the checklist automatic, the engine spool familiar, the afterburner ignition expected, the cockpit ceiling around him second nature. For 26 years that cockpit wasn't just where he flew, it was where he operated in one of the most complex invisible environments on Earth, not just airspace, but the electromagnetic spectrum signals, frequencies, interference. The unseen architecture that powers communication, surveillance, and modern life itself. Most people will go their entire lives without thinking about it. A small number of military professionals don't have that luxury. They understand it. They train in it. They operate inside it. And one of those professionals was Nancy Guthrie's son. 8 years after that final flight, Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in Tucson, Arizona, in the middle of the night. Taken by someone who appeared to understand exactly how to make the cameras around her house stop working, just long enough to get in and out. Whether those two facts are connected is a question that hasn't been publicly answered. But it's a question that becomes harder to ignore the deeper you look. So instead of starting with suspects, we start with the crime itself. This is how behavioral analysis works. You don't begin with a name. You begin with requirements. What did the crime demand? What knowledge? What preparation, what access, would someone need to pull this off? Because when you answer those questions honestly, the list of possible people gets very small very fast. Let's begin with what we know about the night of January 31st, 2026, and then work backward. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in a well-kept home in the Catalina Foothills, one of the quieter, more stable residential areas in Tucson. This wasn't a place where strangers moved unnoticed. Neighbors knew each other. Patterns mattered. Nancy had lived there for 5 decades. She wasn't wealthy. She had no known enemies, no disputes, no lawsuits, no conflicts. There was nothing about her personal life that would attract this level of attention, except one thing: her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, with a publicly reported net worth in the tens of millions. That changes everything. Because now Nancy isn't just an elderly woman living alone, she becomes leverage. And that tells us something critical right away. This wasn't random, it wasn't opportunistic. And it wasn't impulsive. Someone chose her specifically. Out of everyone connected to Savannah, they selected Nancy. Why? Because she was accessible, because she was vulnerable, because she was alone. That kind of targeting doesn't happen by accident. It requires research. It requires familiarity. It usually comes from someone who isn't looking in from the outside, but someone who understands the inside. Now let's break down what this crime actually required to happen, because this is where the profile starts to take shape. Requirement 1. Target intelligence. Whoever did this knew Nancy lived alone. They knew how to get into her house. They knew how to move inside it, find her, and remove her without leaving behind the kind of evidence you'd expect. And they knew something even more specific. Her routine. Every Sunday morning, Nancy attended a virtual church service at a set time. When she didn't show up, that's what triggered concern. That detail isn't public information. You don't find that online. That's the kind of thing you know because you've been close enough to hear it in conversation. Family, friends, inner circle. That's where that kind of knowledge lives. Requirement 2. Physical preparation. The suspect didn't show up unprepared. They arrived equipped. An Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack, something common, unremarkable, impossible to trace to one individual. A holstered firearm, black gloves, a face covering, long sleeves, long pants, every inch of exposed skin covered, not because of the weather, but because of forensics. No fingerprints, no DNA, no identifiable features. This wasn't guesswork. This was someone who understood exactly what investigators look for and how to avoid leaving it behind. Requirement 3. Electronic awareness. This is where the case changes, because this isn't just about breaking into a home. This is about controlling the environment around it. The suspect approached a property with a known Nest doorbell camera. They knew it was there. And something happened that night that investigators have not ignored. Multiple neighbors reported internet disruptions. A Ring camera nearby didn't just fail. It logged its history as not available during the exact window of the abduction. That's not a coincidence investigators overlook. The FBI went door to door asking one very specific question. Did your internet go down that night? And multiple people independently said yes, that matters. Because now we're not just dealing with physical entry, we're dealing with interference, with signals, with disruption. And witnesses described something else. An object in the suspect's jacket pocket described by analysts as antenna-like. That detail might seem small, but in a case like this, it isn't. Requirement 4. Financial design within 24 hours. A ransom note appeared, not sent privately, sent to media outlets. The demand $6 million, not cash, not a wire transfer, Bitcoin. That choice alone tells you something. Because Bitcoin isn't just a buzzword. To use it effectively in a ransom demand, you need to understand wallets, anonymity layers, transaction tracing risks. This isn't casual knowledge, and the number itself, 6 million, is even more revealing. Savannah Guthrie's estimated net worth sits around $40 million. $6 million is roughly 15%. That's not random. That's calculated. It's high enough to create urgency, but low enough to be possible. That kind of precision doesn't come from guessing. It comes from knowing. Now step back and look at the full picture. This crime required inside-level knowledge of the victim's life, careful physical preparation, awareness of forensic evidence, possible understanding of electronic interference, financial intelligence tied to a specific individual. That combination is rare. This is not street-level crime. This is not desperation. This is planning, weeks, possibly months of it. And when you stack those requirements together, something becomes clear. The suspect pool isn't large. It's extremely narrow. Now we move into the most overlooked part of this entire case, the electronic dimension. Because this is where things stop looking like a typical abduction and start looking like something much more specific. In the days after Nancy disappeared, federal agents focused heavily on one detail: connectivity. They weren't asking about suspicious cars. They weren't asking about noises. They were asking about internet drops. That alone tells you what they're thinking. Multiple neighbors confirmed disruptions, different homes, different providers, no coordination between them. And one device, the Ring camera, recorded nothing during the exact time frame that matters most. Not corrupted, not damaged, just gone, marked as not available. That's not normal, and investigators know it. There's debate about what caused it. Some experts argue a Wi-Fi jammer doesn't make sense, because the front door camera still captured footage. Others suggest the device seen on the suspect wasn't a jammer at all, but a radio for communication. Those are valid arguments. But there's a third possibility, not a crude device, not something off the shelf, but something used with precision. Because here's the key detail: you don't need to shut down every camera. You just need to disrupt the ones that matter at the right distance for the right amount of time. And that requires something very specific: understanding how signals behave, how interference spreads, how to control range without exposing yourself. That's not common knowledge, that's trained knowledge. And that brings us back to the beginning, to the cockpit, to 26 years of experience operating in environments where signal control isn't optional, it's essential. Because the same principles apply, different scale, same science. And that connection, whether it means anything or not, is where this investigation starts to become something else entirely. To understand where this case begins to narrow, you have to stay inside the electronic layer a little longer. Because everything about that night suggests one thing. Whoever did this wasn't just avoiding cameras. They were thinking about the entire surveillance environment. Not just what was directly in front of them, but what existed around them. And that's a very different level of thinking. In the days following January 31st, investigators didn't just collect footage. They mapped disruptions. They went house to house asking the same technical question. Did your internet connection drop that night? Not flicker, not slow down. Drop. And multiple residents, without speaking to each other, gave the same answer. Yes. Some didn't even think it mattered, until federal agents showed up asking about it specifically. That's how you know this wasn't a routine detail. Because the FBI doesn't canvass an entire neighborhood over a coincidence. One of the most important data points in this entire case came from a nearby Ring camera. Not because of what it captured, but because of what it didn't. During the exact window investigators care about, the device logged its status as not available, not offline for days, not broken, just unavailable during the one period where it mattered most. That kind of gap raises a very specific question. Was the signal interrupted? Or was something more controlled happening? Now, this is where the expert divide comes in. Because not everyone agrees on what happened. And to understand the case properly, you have to look at both sides. On one side, you have analysts like Morgan Wright. His argument is grounded in physics. If a Wi-Fi jammer was powerful enough to disrupt cameras across the neighborhood, then logically, it should have also disrupted the camera directly in front of the suspect. But that didn't happen. The Nest doorbell camera at Nancy's front door still recorded usable footage. No glitches, no distortion. Which suggests no active jamming at that exact point. That's a strong argument. Then there's another perspective. Retired Detective Lisa Miller looked at the same footage and came to a different conclusion. She believes the device seen in the suspect's pocket wasn't a jammer at all, but a radio, a way to communicate with someone else, an accomplice, someone positioned outside the immediate scene. Because in a situation like this, using a radio avoids cell tower pings. No call logs. No digital footprint. Just direct communication. Clean, efficient, hard to trace. Both of these positions make sense. Both are supported by experience. And neither can be dismissed. But there's a third possibility that sits between them. And it comes from one key statement. Morgan Wright himself said, "To disrupt cameras at that distance, you'd need something closer to military-grade equipment." He didn't say impossible. He said what it would require. And that matters. Because once you define the level of equipment needed, you also define the level of training required to use it correctly. Here's the distinction that changes everything. A typical jammer, used by someone without deep knowledge, would create chaos. It would knock out everything, including the camera directly in front of it. That's not what we see here. What we see is selective impact, nearby disruptions, missing footage at range, but usable video at the point of entry. That's not sloppy. That's controlled. And control implies understanding. Understanding how signals weaken over distance. Understanding how interference behaves at the edges of range. Understanding how to operate within that range without overexposing yourself. That's not something you improvise. That's something you learn. Now think about the sequence again. The suspect approaches the house. They don't rush. They don't hesitate. They move with purpose. They reach the front door. They disable the camera physically. A gloved hand. A shrub. Simple. Effective. Because they don't need to jam that camera. They just need to remove it. But the surrounding environment, that's different. That's where interference matters. That's where you prevent other angles, other views, other recordings that could show a vehicle arriving, a vehicle leaving, movement across the street. That's what needs to be suppressed. Not everything, just enough. And when you look at it that way, the pieces start to align. The neighbor disruptions, the missing ring footage, the antenna-like object, the lack of broader system failure. It doesn't look like random interference. It looks measured. And that brings us to the uncomfortable part of the analysis. Because once you accept that level of precision, you have to ask, who actually has that kind of skill? Not theoretically, not casually, but professionally. This is where most coverage stops. It acknowledges the disruption. It mentions the debate. And then it moves on. But if you follow the thread all the way through, you don't move on. You go deeper. Because signal control, real signal control, isn't a hobby. It's a discipline. It's something people train for years, in environments where getting it wrong has consequences far beyond a camera feed. And that's where the conversation shifts. From what happened to who could realistically make it happen. Before we go further, take a second. If you're following this breakdown and it's making you see the case differently, hit the like button. Not for the algorithm, but because it helps push detailed analysis like this to more people who are actually trying to understand what happened here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what we're about to get into is where this case stops being general and starts becoming specific. Let's go back to the beginning again. Not the abduction, but the training. An F-16 Fighting Falcon isn't just a jet. It's a platform, a system, and the pilots who fly it aren't just trained to maneuver in the air. They're trained to operate in contested environments, where signals are weaponized, where communication can be disrupted, where radar can be manipulated. Electronic warfare isn't optional in that world. It's fundamental. Every F-16 pilot learns it. Not at a surface level, but operationally, practically, repeatedly. Let's break down what that actually means. Because it's not abstract. It's specific. Radar jamming. The ability to send out signals that confuse or overwhelm an enemy system. Creating false readings. Hiding real ones. Altering what the other side sees. Electronic countermeasures. Recognizing when you're being tracked. Identifying the type of signal. Responding with the correct interference. At the right frequency. At the right power. Signal intelligence. Understanding what different systems emit. What frequencies they use. How far they reach. How they behave in different environments. And maybe most important of all, signal discipline. Knowing what you're emitting. How detectable you are. And how to operate without revealing your position. This isn't theory. It's repetition. Years of it. Under pressure. Until it becomes instinct. Think about any skill you've mastered. Driving. Typing. Speaking a language. At some point, you stop thinking about it. You just do it. For someone who has spent decades in electronic warfare, signal behavior becomes that kind of instinct. You don't guess what interference will do. You know. Now bring that back to Tucson. To a quiet neighborhood. To a night where signals behaved differently. Not randomly, but in a way that suggests control. And suddenly, the gap between those two worlds doesn't feel as wide. Because the skill set required to influence that environment is the same skill set taught in one very specific place. And that's where the investigation begins to intersect with something else. Something that, up until now, hasn't been fully examined in public. Because inside Nancy Guthrie's own family, there is someone whose entire professional life was built around exactly that domain. Signal awareness, electronic interference, operational control of electromagnetic environments. That doesn't mean guilt. It doesn't mean involvement. But it does mean relevance. And in an investigation like this, relevance matters. Because when you build a profile from the crime outward, you're not looking for coincidence. You're looking for alignment. And what we're about to get into next is where that alignment becomes impossible to ignore. Before we go there, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on. Because this next part is where the media coverage stops and the real questions begin. Now we move from capability to connection. Because everything we've covered so far builds toward one unavoidable point. When a crime requires a very specific skill set, and someone close to the victim has spent a lifetime developing that exact skill set, it becomes relevant, not as an accusation, but as a question that has to be examined. Let's bring the focus back to the family, specifically to one name, Colonel Charles Cameron Guthrie, call sign Arlo. For 26 years, he flew F-16 Fighting Falcons with the Vermont Air National Guard's 158th Fighter Wing. That's not a short career. That's not surface-level experience. That's a full professional lifetime inside one of the most technically demanding environments in military aviation. And as we've already established, electronic warfare is not optional in that role. It's foundational. When he retired from flying in 2018, that wasn't the end of his service. He transitioned into a non-flying role within the same organization, which means his connection to that environment didn't stop. It continued. And while the details of that role haven't been publicly disclosed, senior officers in that position typically remain involved in operations, planning, training, intelligence, all areas that rely heavily on accumulated expertise. Now pause for a second, because this is where things can get misunderstood if you move too fast. This is not about drawing conclusions. This is about understanding relevance. There is nothing unusual about a decorated military career. Nothing suspicious about privacy. Nothing inherently meaningful about someone not having a strong public digital footprint. On their own, those things don't point anywhere. But when you place them inside the context of this case, they become part of a larger pattern. Let's look at the public record. After his retirement from flying, Cameron Guthrie has maintained almost no visible digital presence. No active social media. No listed employer. No public-facing professional activity. For someone with that level of experience and rank, that's uncommon. Not impossible, but uncommon. Then there's the timeline. In the days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Cameron traveled to Arizona. He appeared publicly with his sisters. He spoke directly to whoever had taken his mother. His message was clear. They hadn't heard from the kidnappers. They needed a way to communicate. They were waiting. Everything about that moment was consistent with a family in crisis. But after that, the public record becomes thinner. Around day 30 of the investigation, the family returned to Nancy's home. They placed flowers. They left a handwritten message. Savannah was there. Annie was there. It was documented, photographed, reported. Cameron was not publicly documented as being present that day. Now, that alone doesn't prove anything. There are countless normal explanations for someone missing a single event. But in an investigation like this, patterns matter. An absence becomes part of the pattern. Then there's another gap. A very specific one. On January 31st, the night Nancy was taken, one family member's movements were outlined in detail. Timestamps, locations, a clear sequence of events. That information was presented publicly. Cameron Guthrie's location that same night has not been publicly confirmed, not detailed, not addressed, not placed on record. Now, that doesn't mean investigators don't know. They almost certainly do. At the federal level, establishing someone's location is routine. Cell tower data, financial transactions, travel records, digital forensics. That information exists. But there's a difference between what investigators know and what the public knows. And in this case, that difference is visible. Now let's move to what may be the most revealing part of the entire case. The ransom. Multiple notes were sent to media outlets. Not quietly, not privately, publicly. That alone tells you something about the intent. This wasn't just about communication. It was about pressure. The demand was clear. $6 million. In Bitcoin. Let's break that down. Because both parts matter. First, the currency. Bitcoin. Not cash. Not bank transfer. Not anything tied to traditional financial systems. That choice reflects understanding. Because Bitcoin, when handled correctly, offers layers of anonymity. Wallet addresses, transaction chains, obfuscation methods. This isn't casual knowledge. It's either learned deliberately or encountered professionally. Now the number. 6 million. Savannah Guthrie's estimated net worth is around $40 million. 6 million is roughly 15%. That's not random. That's calibrated. It's high enough to create urgency. High enough to be taken seriously. But not so high that it becomes impossible. That balance is intentional. And here's the key question. How does someone arrive at that number? Not generally. Specifically. Because knowing someone is wealthy isn't enough. Public estimates don't give you precision. They give you ranges. Approximations. But 6 million feels precise. It suggests knowledge beyond headlines, beyond public reports. It suggests familiarity with assets, liquidity, financial structure, and that kind of knowledge usually exists in one place. Close proximity, family. Now add one more layer. Estimated financial standing. A colonel retiring after 26 years of service under standard military compensation structures is comfortable, respected, stable, but not operating at the same financial level as a major national media figure. That creates a gap, a large one. And again, on its own, that doesn't mean anything. Wealth differences between siblings are common, normal. But inside this context, where a ransom demand reflects precise financial calibration, that gap becomes part of the equation. Because someone knew what Savannah had, and someone structured a demand around it. Now, before we go further, if you've stayed with this breakdown this far, take a moment to like the video. Not because it's expected, but because it helps this kind of detailed analysis reach people who are actually trying to understand what's happening here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what we're about to close with ties everything together. Let's talk about what law enforcement has said. On February 16, 2026, 15 days after the abduction, the sheriff publicly cleared all family members. No suspects. No persons of interest. Everyone cooperative. Everyone treated as victims. That statement matters, and it has to be acknowledged. But timing also matters. At that point in the investigation, key forensic evidence was still being processed. DNA samples from the scene had not been fully analyzed. A mixed profile indicating more than one individual was still under review. A glove found miles away had been tested against national databases. No match. That means the clearance came before some of the most critical evidence was finalized. Now, that doesn't invalidate the clearance. Investigators may have had other data. Digital records, alibis, timelines, information that hasn't been made public. But from a strictly factual standpoint, the public record shows the case was still developing, and the clearance was issued. That creates a gap. Not a contradiction, but a gap. Now there's one final technical detail that brings everything full circle. Nancy Guthrie has a pacemaker, a device that emits a detectable signal. At one point in the investigation, the FBI deployed a helicopter equipped to detect that signal. The idea was simple. If Nancy was within range, they might find her. But here where it gets interesting. If someone wanted to counter that detection, they would need to do something very specific. They would need to understand what frequency the pacemaker operates on, how to interfere with that frequency, how much power is required, and how to apply that interference without creating broader detectable effects. That's not simple. That's not common. But it is familiar, because it's the same type of problem we've already discussed. Signal detection, signal suppression, range control, electromagnetic awareness. Different scenario, same skill set. And that brings us to the final point. This video has not made an accusation. It has not named a suspect. It has not challenged the official clearance. What it has done is follow the evidence, step by step, requirement by requirement. And when you do that, you arrive at a very specific question. If this crime involved controlled electronic interference, and if that interference required specialized knowledge, and if someone within the victim's immediate circle spent 26 years professionally trained in that exact domain, has that connection been fully examined? That's not speculation. That's not theory. That's a documented question. And questions like that don't go away, because this case is still open. The task force is still active, and Nancy Guthrie is still missing. She is 84 years old. She requires daily medication. She has limited mobility, and she was taken from the home she lived in for 50 years by someone who came prepared in ways most criminals never are. Someone out there knows what happened that night. They've known for weeks, and the longer they carry it, the heavier it gets. If you have any information, anything at all, about January 31st, any unusual activity, any detail that didn't make sense at the time but does now, report it anonymously, because one detail is all it takes. We started this story with two facts. A man trained for decades to understand and control electromagnetic environments, and a night where signals in a quiet neighborhood didn't behave the way they should. Those two facts may be connected. They may not be, but they are worth examining carefully, completely, because if the electronic element of this crime was intentional, Then whoever did this brought knowledge into that neighborhood that most people simply do not have. And inside Nancy Guthrie's own world, there is someone for whom that knowledge was a career. That's not a conclusion. It's the question that remains. If this breakdown gave you something the mainstream coverage hasn't, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every confirmed development in this case will be covered here the moment it happens. Share this with someone following the investigation. And if you have a perspective, add it in the comments. Because the more people looking closely at this case, the harder it becomes for the truth to stay hidden. Nancy Guthrie is still out there. And this story is not over.